Let's move on to the next exercise. So we're going to create a sphere, right? So now we're going to start to create geometrical objects in Rhino's viewport. And in order to do that, we're actually going to have to focus on two new concepts, which are data types and variables. All right, so this is what we're going to achieve. Not that exciting quite yet, but bear with me, and we will have some much more exciting things to work with later on in the webinar. So before we actually create the sphere, we need to talk about data generally, right? Data is just anything that we want to store, right? And it's probably relatively easy to understand it generically, right? A number, a bottle, a horse, right? Anything, my name, any one of those things is data that we can store, right? So a horse, a bottle, and my name are very different, right? One's an animal, one's an object, and one is a set of characters, right? Like GIL. So data types are important to understand, although Python is very forgiving when it comes to data types. We don't actually have to tell Python that when we store that bottle, that it needs to be known as an object type as opposed to a set of characters, right? But we have to be aware of the different types because the RhinoScript methods do require us to be specific. All right, so just a quick run through of some of the more useful data types. We talked about my name, right? That is a string. That's a collection of characters, right? We've also started to talk about a point, which is X, Y, and Z, an array. And we can also, I probably want to also point out integer and double. An integer is just a whole number, 5, 17, 23. And a double is any number with a decimal place. So 5.5 is a double type. All right, and going along with data and actually using it, we need to be conscious of what a variable is. And a variable is just something that stores data, right? It stores the horse for us to use later, or it stores my name so I can remember it later. And data consists of all different types of things, right? You can think of it as a measurement, like a unit, like 5.5 units, or a state of a particular characteristic, right? Is the light bulb on or off, right? And being able to know the state of that light bulb is important so that we can use that light bulb later as a simple analogy. We can think of variables as storage devices capable of holding things for us to later call by name and then use. So here's a simple diagram, right? We have some bit of data, right? This is the horse, the bottle, my name. We're going to store it in a variable. We'll call this my box or my variable. The data will go in that variable and it will be remembered for us to use later, right? So first we bought the horse, and the horse's name is Sandy, right? So whenever I want to go ride the horse, I need to go find Sandy's stall at the stables and then bring Sandy out and go for a ride, right? So the variable, you can think of it as a name or a container with a name that allows us to access that bit of data later. Okay, going back to the breakpoint, if we create a breakpoint in our script, it's really useful for finding out what's stored in each one of our containers or our variables. And this is a great option for debugging our script. If something's not working as we expect it, something's weird, right? We can use the breakpoint to see what's going on real time, kind of pause the script, and then tell it to complete. All right, so let's create our sphere. So let's go back to Rhino, and we don't need this little bit of hello world text. And I'm going to move into a kind of split screen view where I have Rhino on one side and I have my script editor my Python editor on the right side. Okay. So the idea here is that we want to create a sphere. So if we were to do this in Rhino, right? If we were to go to the solids menu and we choose sphere by center radius, the command line asks us to choose the center of the sphere and then the radius, which we can either do by typing into the command line or moving our mouse along the plane that it's being drawn in to define the radius, right? So the two key things that are required for creating a sphere are, in this case, center and radius. Okay, so let's replicate that same logic in a script, right? So the first thing that we want to do is we want to create our pseudocode, right? This is our plain language description of what we want to do. All right, so the first thing we want to do is import our Rhino script syntax library, right? So we'll give ourselves a note here, import Rhino script syntax. I'll just do an abbreviation since it's a note. All right, the next thing is that we have to define a radius value, right? That was the second thing it asked for. So if we wanted to mimic exactly how Rhino asked us to create that sphere, the second action would actually be to define a center point, right? Then define a radius, and then the last action is to actually create the sphere. All right, so remember the hashtag or the pound sign is what's going to allow us to create a comment that is ignored by the computer. And those are notes for us humans, right? All right, and so the first line is exactly what we did before, which is import Rhino script syntax as rs, and that's our shortcut. We don't actually have to do as rs, but it makes our script a lot cleaner. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we want to define a center point. So before we typed our center point as just numbers, right? We did open parentheses, 0, 0, 0, close parentheses. All right, so that is a successful format for an X, Y, Z point. But if we just type it, Python doesn't know what to do with it, right? Or another way to say that is, if we type it, it's understood here, but nowhere else, right? So the thing that we're going to do first is that we're going to define a variable to store that point information so that we can reuse it later. So let's make a variable called myPoint equals 0, 0, 0. So this is our first variable, right? myPoint. And the variable name can be anything, but a good practice is that, like, you can just call this A or B or C. But a good practice is to make something short but is understandable. myPoint. That sounds good. That's a great place to start, right? And I'm using camel case, and there's no spaces in here. All right. The next thing I want to do is I want to define a radius. So let's also do this numerically. So something like 5.25, that sounds like an interesting radius value, but again, we need to store it so that we can use it later. The same way we're doing with myPoint, we're taking 0, 0, 0, and we're storing it inside of myPoint variable. We're going to do that with the radius here. So one more note about the structure of this. This bit of information is going to be stored or assigned to this variable. All right. So does anyone have a suggestion on what we might call the variable for our radius? Go ahead and type that into the questions window. All right, so I got a couple of suggestions, and let's talk about them. My radius. Do we think this will work? No. Why? Python is sensitive to what? Space. So this needs to be one word, my radius, right? And again, this is called camel case, where you use lower cases and then every new word that's smushed together gets an uppercase letter. So my radius equals 5.25. And again, if your name is something else, you could call this Gil's radius or your name, however you would like to define this variable. But for my purposes right now, I'll just call it my radius to keep things simple. All right, last step, create the sphere. All right, so in order to do this action that's related to, it's called camel case. There's a question in the question window. This is the kind of computer scientist's shortcut, and it's conventionally called camel case. Okay, so in order to access the methods that go along with RhinoScript, we need to first call to the shortcut to access the RhinoScript syntax. So that's rs dot. And anytime I want to add some object into the 3D environment, I'm going to be using the first three letters, add, and let's see if there's something called add sphere, and there it is. So I'm going to hit enter, open parentheses. It's now understood as a keyword, right? That's a method that it understands. And here in the output window, it's telling us again the parameters, or what are also called arguments, for that particular method. So it's asking for the center, which we'll call a point, and the radius. So here we're going to say add sphere, open parentheses, my point, comma, my radius. Okay, so rs.addSphere, my point, my radius. So I'm going to go ahead and hit start debugging or play. Now, I just got an error message, right? It's my first error. In the output window, you'll see that it turns a kind of light red, and it tells us some information. My radius is not defined. Line 11 in this script. So here's line 11, add sphere, my point, my radius. Does anybody have a suggestion as to why it's not working? I'm using the same radius name, my radius. Exactly. I mistyped. I had a typo. I needed it to be my radius. Again, it's case sensitive. All right, you guys are sharp. Well done. All right, so if we hit play, now we'll create a sphere that's radius 5.25 at the 0, 0, 0 point.